First of all, welcome, Ainissa. So let's start with the path of Ainissa from New Jersey. I don't even know which town in New Jersey, so start there. Gets to Stanford, to Yale, via Bell Labs, and now an author. What's the trajectory look like there? Can you tell a little bit of your sort of story? Because I think in that story is probably an interesting narrative about how the Alchemy of Us came about.
Sure. So my life story probably is just the generation before. My family actually came from the Caribbean, from Antigua, and they lived in England before they came to New Jersey. I actually was born in New York and then grew up in New Jersey and loved science from a very, very young age. And one of the things that got me motivated about science was actually television in the 70s and 80s. There were some fantastic sci-fi shows like Star Trek, which I still love, the original one.
I like the original one with the
The
tribbles
original
and all
one,
that.
yeah. There was the Bionic Woman. I'm still afraid of fembots. If you look, it doesn't look like much, but I was very afraid of those at the time. The $6 Million Man, I had a $6 Million Man doll. I wish I had it today because I could sell it for a lot of money. But the show that really turned me on was a show called 3-2-1 Contact, which was a PBS show. Very low production, but it had kids solving problems. One of the kids was an African-American girl. And when I saw her, I saw my reflection. And I said, well, I don't know what she's doing. I asked my mom. She said she's doing science. I said, well, that's what I want to be. So I grew up in Jersey City, in New Jersey, and went to Catholic school there, and then went to an all-girls Catholic school called St. Dominic's, and did very well. That was a great place for me because I really got to focus on my studies, which was, as a first generation, as being first generation, my inheritance was my education. So I really had to just focus on my studies. And
then how do you get from Jersey to your next hop?
Well, I applied to different schools and I got into Brown and was torn between Brown and Cornell. Cornell was giving me a great financial package and Brown wasn't. But when I went to Brown, I really liked the type of student that came out, which is the students who had a broad interest, not just engineering, not just science, but, could talk about different things. And I said, I think that's the kind of person I want to be. So I went to Brown and I studied material science there. I had great professors. We studied old style materials, which was metallurgy, but there was a new professor who was doing things that were related to computers, how to, the materials in computers. And I had talked to him and I said, I want to know how to build the materials in a computer. He's like, well, you have to go to Stanford to do that. I said, okay. So I applied for graduate school and went to Stanford. That's where I got my doctorate. And I didn't work on the computer per se. I worked on the hard disk, which was fascinating, learning about magnetism and tribology and things like that. And wanted to stay in California. In fact, once you go to California, you never really want to leave.
At least for the weather.
For the weather, right. And at the time, the cost wasn't as crazy. It's crazy, but it wasn't as crazy. But Bell Labs was hiring, and there was this gentleman named Don Murphy. He was a chemist who came to Stanford, and he was interviewing for postdocs. And I said, well, Bell Labs has been, a dream job. It didn't hire very much at the time. I said, well, I've got to interview. I wasn't expecting to get a position. And landed at Bell Labs. And that was one of the best moves that ever happened to me because I really loved my time there. Great scientists. Across the hall from me was Horst Stormer, who won a Nobel Prize. So, that's a great place to be as a young person.
So then you end up at Yale next?
I went to Yale. Mm-hmm. So I was there for about 10 years. I was an assistant professor and then associate professor in mechanical engineering. That's where a lot of material scientists were. And also started doing programs for children. I had a lecture series for kids where I brought in scientists it was in the month of October and April, where on Saturdays we had, famous people talk for about 30 minutes to young people. And I really loved that program. And I was starting to feel, I think I actually like the communicating of science more than the research part.
So does that lead somehow to the Alchemy of Us?
Well, I've always been in the process of trying to get people excited about science. And after I left Yale, I was creating explainer videos and writing articles, living as a science writer and science communicator. But the Alchemy of Us was my attempt to get people to be more excited about material science. And there are lots of books about material science where they focus on the material. Here's copper, here's iron, and tell you all about it. But I really wanted to reach a broader audience. And I knew that the way to do that was with stories. So that's where the Alchemy of Us came from.
That's fantastic. And so let's get to the Alchemy of Us. I think it's such a wonderful book. How did you uncover the narrative arc? Was it just that you knew up front these stories were probably stories of imperfect people, or how did it come to you?
Well, I've learned from taking many courses in writing that your characters have to have some flaw in order for people to resonate with them. And often in science, when we hear about somebody like Thomas Edison, we just hear how smart he is, and no one ever feels that they can ever do what he did. But if you learn about his flaws and he's a little bit more down to earth, maybe you won't be able to do everything he's able to do, but you'll feel like you can overcome challenges as he did. And so while researching the Alchemy of Us, I knew about the key people, but then I would have to go to archives. So there's libraries, societies, there's a lot of historical societies. I actually went abroad to England to go to different libraries as well to get the old papers of these scientists. So, I got the papers for J.J. Thomson, who discovered the electron, and I got the papers for Edison. And you just read his letters and his papers and also newspaper articles that were written around the time and learn about the birth of their invention. What did it take to happen? And you read a lot of books as well. And I wanted to grab the story so that the story actually carries you. I pepper in the science because a lot of people don't love science. For the audiences that we're talking to, they love science already. So this book will definitely suit them because they'll learn more about the human side, but that's not the thing that will pull them in. But for a lot of people, science kind of turns them off, but stories will always pull people in. So I had to uncover the story and then pepper in the science to take people from not knowing to knowing.
So that was an intentional style you had learned, and it's very powerful. I agree. So you sort of found the flaws by design, but not over magnify them. They're part and parcel of the process of invention. Did you find that in each case it was a flaw that gave rise to the obsession as much as it was a positive trait in the person? I always like to think that the thing that is the origin of our brilliance is also the origin of our problems.
That's a very good point. Sometimes it was two sides of the same coin. So there's one gentleman, Amon Stroger, who didn't like the telephone operator. He thought the telephone operators were steering away his business because
from his funeral home, right?
He had a funeral home and he was losing business. He looked at the newspaper and he saw his friend died, and we're not sure if he was mad that his friend had died or that his competition embalmed the body. And so he was a little bit of a crazy guy. People knew him that way. And so he was very passionate, and he's actually the one who came up with the automatic exchange. And so his tendency to be a little erratic might have been also that helped him design that invention. So that happens sometimes, but that's not what I always focused on. I always just tried to make them a little bit more human so that you can see, oh, this person is not so far off from me.
And maybe human by definition is flawed. And so in each
Perhaps.
Telling of a human story, there are flaws, which I think is what's so wonderful, as you say, because we all know we're flawed in some way, but we shouldn't become depressed or demoralized by that, because in fact, we can use those flaws for good if we can overcome them, because they can give rise to drive and obsession and need to prove ourselves. But at the same time, we can turn that into a force for good.
Absolutely. If you have a different perspective on the world, this is your point of innovation, because you're able to see something that someone else can't see. So, flaws can be features sometimes.
So let's talk about some of those cases, because what I find so interesting about them is, in particular, the idea that that what happened with the technology was unforeseen in many cases, and in fact, many of the things that were unforeseen were biases that came in because of a company's agenda or a person's agenda to meet the popular need because of mass production needs. And when you go after mass production, you go after where the money is, and generally that excludes some. And in that exclusive process, you don't ever correct for it, or at least only when another demand comes along. So did you find that it wasn't that you thought that was the case, it was a discovery each time that the invention led to something unintended?
Well, it's a very good question, and we're talking specifically about photography and camera film. And it actually came from my own personal experience. I have a very, very dear friend of mine. I'm African American, she's not, and we've known each other for 3 decades, and we don't have good photographs of each other. And so, and many, many years, I had an internship at a film manufacturer when I was very young in high school. And I had learned a little bit about the Shirley card, that is the standard that was used to make sure that things were calibrated. And so I knew about the Shirley card, and I knew about how there was some difficulty in rendering people who had darker skin. But that information was just pocketed in my head decades ago. And when I was writing this book, and focusing on photography, I was like, wait a minute, I remember the trouble that we used to have with calibrating darker skin. Let me see if anybody's analyzed that. And then I saw that there were some papers and some people who thought quite a bit about this. And so I wanted to bring that to bear, because it didn't seem like a readily known bit of information, but just kind of an insidery within the photography world bit of information.
And I think that there was that, which is a wonderful one. And it covers both Kodak and Polaroid, right? In some ways, and the consequences of that were just amazing. And those of you who've read the story, it's just an amazing unintended consequence, but an ignorance once it was revealed. I think that's the interesting. But once it's revealed, there's an ignorance and an opposition. But in the end, it's corrected for by the actions of people who bucked the system.
Well, also, I mean, my impression in the Polaroid story is that the leadership at the time was really focused on doing the science and didn't want to be bothered with societal impact. It's like, look, I'm really making this fantastic technology, and they treated people who brought the bias to them like a gnat. They just wanted to swat them away. I really want to focus on what I'm doing. But what we know and what we've learned in science is that everything we do is in a context. And so, you know, we're not divorced from it. And what we make is in this huger society, and we should respond accordingly.
I found it interesting that frustration, at least, and bias comes in for impatience with words. It comes about because Morse needs to be succinct in his encoding, or have an encoding that allows rapid transmission, so messages can be shorter because there wasn't great multiplexing of messages. The time duration of a message mattered. And so succinctness comes in a form which then influences literature through Hemingway, etc., and journalism. So that's a bias of another type that is, and a bias in the generalized meaning of we've sort of tweaked a certain parameter, and that results in a whole set of unintended consequences.
Right. Well, to me, that seems more like a technological bias. Like there was a limitation of the technology, of the telegraph. It could only send a couple of messages at a time. And so we adjusted ourselves to it. And if we thought that the length of sentences was important, we could have made some modifications to the telegraph. I don't know what that would have been. But what we did is we just were so desirous to send messages very, very quickly that we just made the modification and didn't really think about that again. So, so that's one of the unintended consequences, that the shortcoming of the telegraph helped to shape language.
So let's go a little bit forward from that. We're now in the text message age.
Right.
And we were just talking before we started this call. We're also now in the COVID-19 era, where we are forced to be remote, and maybe that's going to last on and off a decade or so in different variants of this condition. It seems reasonable to assert that might be true, but even if it doesn't, I think our habits might be changed beyond the duration of the pandemic. So what do we think is the way that people will start communicating? Is short going to fall out of favor? Is video comms going to become the norm, which is a longer form? If you
Hmm.
invest in a video call, it's not a trivial investment. Do
Hmm.
you see some sense of how we might change going forward?
I do think there'll be a change. I don't know what it is quite yet. I think we need a little bit more time. I know that since we are still new to this world, this COVID world, that Zoom was certainly embraced. But now I'm hearing about Zoom fatigue. People are very tired of it and do want to interact. So there may be. I think that things will change. Zoom will definitely be part of our portfolio, but maybe not always. I think people really desire to be interacting with each other in some ways. I know that when I'm on the phone or I'm on a call, that people talk a little longer than they used to. We used to be so, you wanted to expedite getting information across, but we're so longing to connect that people are chatting more than they usually are, and I think that we have to be more compassionate with each other in this time. But maybe we're starting to value the connections that we have, and so it won't be all text messages. We'll do Zoom, but we'll also make sure that we see each other. We won't put things off. Maybe that has a technological link, but I think we're still learning what's important to us from COVID.
I think you're right. I think the clues are there in some ways, and I wonder whether the recent sort of societal turmoil is catalyzed by COVID in some ways. I was telling you as we started in Bell Labs, we found that there was an inequity perceived but never spoken about, just because
Mm.
people were or weren't in Murray Hill, which is
Mm.
the epicenter of Murray Hill. But now in the COVID-19 era, everyone feels more like they are equivalent, and therefore, even in this very sort of limited community, people are more able to speak up
That's
because they
great.
don't feel like they're not part of the large corporate headquarters of sort of Bell Labs. And if you're not in that, you feel second class in some way.
Hmm.
So we've seen more exchange and more dialogue. And the video helps a bit because the idea of a voice from the darkness, right? Meaning that you can't really, is disembodied voice. People, one, don't feel like speaking up if that's the case, and if they do, it feels disjoint with the people who are actually in the room together. So
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think the idea of video and equivalence has actually caused more dialogue, but I don't know if you've started seeing the same.
Well, that's great. I think the leadership that you have there, Marcus, is that you're identifying that and seeing that, because a lot of people just want to go back to normal. And again, I think there are many lessons in COVID, and we can be astute. So you're seeing that it's a great equalizer, and so that you need to do more to make people feel included, which is great, which is wonderful. And I think that in innovation, as with anything, we our position is that we should always be looking to see if there's something to be pulled from this. Is there something to discover? Is there something new? And I think that as scientists, that's what we're well primed to do. So we should just be keeping our eyes open instead of looking for normal. We should be saying, okay, where are the opportunities?
I very much like that idea. Is these are the cues. We've been talking in Bell Labs about the next phase of the internet
Mm-hmm.
is increasing human productivity, and we emphasize the human part. But
Mm-hmm.
most people hear the productivity part and say, "Oh, that sounds a bit boring. It sounds like an industrial
Mm-hmm.
something. Maybe a machine operates more efficiently, or a mode of transportation is more efficient, but it doesn't feel connected to people." But I think with the work from home, the idea of humans and machines sort of interacting more seamlessly
Mm-hmm.
from anywhere. We need extensions of ourselves, and I think machines in many ways are created to be extensions of ourselves. And now I think
Right.
everyone's beginning to realize that the only way that life is going to work better is if we're able to remotely control and interact with things in a more seamless way. So let's go back to some of your other stories, which I find so fascinating. Let's go to the transistor, of course, a favorite of mine.
Mm-hmm.
That I love the idea that a hierarchy in Bell Labs prevented the Thiel and his germanium single crystals from being recognized. I think that's a classic story of hierarchy and those who control things suppressing those who who don't. But in the end, of course, it created this amazing device, amplifying switch,
Mm-hmm.
which then makes telephony possible at massive scale.
Right.
And then, but the unintended consequence of for sure was telephony could then become computing. There was no, I think, sense that we would then turn what was a telephony device into a digital computation device
Computer.
that would revolutionize the world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what do you think? And then, well, the other part of the story I really like is that both Thiel had to leave and found Texas Instruments, and Shockley, Bardeen, etc., went to Silicon Valley and started Silicon Valley because they felt constrained within the corporate environment they were in.
Mm-hmm.
So I always think that that's another interesting part of the story. Do you find that in the end, large corporations tend to sort of suppress the innovator, and the innovator has to leave to start the next phase of things? Or is that not part of what you found? It often seemed to be the case that someone became frustrated in the corporate entity and then left and had to do something, had to take another path.
Sometimes corporations can be constraining, especially if you have a new idea and if there is this pecking order. And Thiel had other motivations for moving to Texas. He was originally from Texas. He really felt like a fish out of water in New England. His family was in Texas, and so he, once an opportunity came, and also he wanted to be a star at Bell Laboratories, and it was really hard when the transistor came. So he said, well, I'm just going to go back to Texas, and there's a small business that called Texas Instrument where I will be king. And so that was his motivation. But sometimes corporations have a certain culture, sort of like the telegraph. They will constrain what can happen because of the culture. And so in the case of the transistor, some folks had to leave to go to California. Similarly with IBM. IBM, as you know, has a very rigid culture. Creativity, decades ago, was very, very rigid. And so if you didn't wear your blue suit and white shirt, you were an odd person. And what they needed was someone who was very, very creative. And so they actually had to go to California to go get that kind of creativity. So I think it's a little different now. I mean, corporations know that creativity comes in all shapes and sizes, and it's not the person who fits that model. But decades ago, that wasn't necessarily the case.
Yeah, and I think we can credit the internet with that, is that exposure to different ideas and different origins of innovation has been one of the positive consequences. That you're not just within this certain building and you dress and behave in a certain way. I think there has been the sense that access to different ways of doing things in real time and the ability for people to demonstrate those innovations probably is one of the very positive parts of the internet infrastructure. So the transistor, born out of frustration in some ways, or born out of a need, dispersed around the globe to Texas Instruments and Silicon Valley by frustration, then allowed perhaps other innovators to appear over the internet infrastructure. So that's the positive side, I think, of the internet.
Yeah. Well, when I was at Bell Laboratories, there was certainly a pecking order, but what I actually found is that people just looked at the quality of your ideas. So maybe when I was there in the late 90s, early 2000s, that, I might have been a material scientist, which is lower in the pecking order. But if I had a great idea, I could just talk to the physicists, which were higher, and we would make something happen.
Yep.
So that pecking order started to diffuse over time. And I found, at Bell Labs, I spent some time at MIT. That pecking order is kind of gone. It's really the quality of ideas. You could talk to a person who has a Nobel laureate, and if the idea seems to resonate between the two of you, that's all it really takes.
Yeah, I think that is the case, and that was always my experience. I'm glad you had the same experience, which is if the idea was good enough, the pecking order really didn't matter. It was there as a nominal thing because people are tribal, right? Frankly, it's just a sort of tribal behavior, and someone established physicists at the top of the hierarchy, and of course, physicists weren't going to dispute that. So, the other tribes have to find their place, and then the pecking order is established. But in the end, I think if you went and talked to someone who had a great idea and a great thought process, they really didn't care. So there we are to the internet, and they're sending some questions in, which we'll now get to. How do you manage fake news in the world today and reduce it, modify it, moderate it, flag it?
I do know on a granular level, when it's person to person, you can U-turn fake news. So I have some friends, I go to this bookstore all the time. Some are supporters for their administration. It's me, when I spend time with them and explain things to them and show them things, I can get them to turn around. So we have to really tap into the behaviors, the values of things that people honor in order to get our message across. And as scientists, we can't hit data with data. This is what I've learned. The reason why I wrote my book, The Alchemy of Us, is that it's really about busting myths. You know, if I just said this is what happened, the silicon transistor changed our brains, people would say, well, it didn't change my brain, so I'm not going to listen to you. But if I tell you the story and I show you things of how things modified, people, you draw people in, you make them feel comfortable, you meet people where they are. That's how you can change behavior. So I don't know how to do that on a coding level, but that's what I would.
That's a lovely explanation of the book. I do agree. Every chapter I read, I see myself in it.
Great.
And I see also the unavoidability of what you're saying must be true, because you also have the logical argument is strong, but written in a narrative that is not threatening. And I think
Great.
that's why the book is so wonderful. What's your thinking on how we interact with machine systems? And of course, intelligent machines increasingly is what people are concerned about.
Well, it is the future. And I think that as long as we keep that our main thrust is that we're always enhancing humanity, I think if we keep that as our mission, then we're in good shape. But machines have always helped us. I mean, the telegraph was a machine. It helped us to send information rapidly. But there'll be more information. There'll be more machines that will help us. You know, exoskeletons. Those will be machines. We'll have to make sure that these machines, you know, again, enhance humanity, but they're also used in positive ways, because you can actually see a nefarious use for exoskeletons too. Sometimes we can design that out, sometimes we can't, but we should always be mindful that our technologies may not go in the directions that we want.
And in fact, they rarely do,
Yeah.
your book says.
Yeah. Well, no, I think it's mostly that there's a few people where it kind of goes awry. There are many other technologies that worked out the way, you know, they were supposed to work out. Like my glass cup right over here, it's doing that. It's holding water. It's not doing anything else. But sometimes technologies do things that we don't want.
Oh, very true. And probably the more sophisticated technology, the more it can be used for other things, because I can repurpose it, reprogram it, whatever it is.
Right.
Obviously, your glass isn't really capable of being anything other than the inanimate material it is, because it's not sort of programmable or electronic. So that's interesting. Absolutely. I do agree. Humans have never invented, well, machines have never invented themselves. Even in AI systems, there's sort of, you know, transfer learning and generative adversarial networks. They're not really inventing another machine. They're inventing some more data for them to operate on. So actually, we do in Bell Labs talk about augmented humans as the goal, where machines are an extension of humans as they've always been to allow us to see or move or communicate further. So I firmly believe that is the future. I think the interesting part is, will there be a set of machines that help us take the overwhelming amount of data we are now exposed to and turn it into meaningful knowledge? And I think there has to be. These are the role of AI systems is that, in my view. But it also should contextualize it for us, because it can't take all knowledge. It has to be the knowledge I need at the point in time. And ideally, the way I need to know it, because I think differently than other people. Is that a great hope that'll be the next era of machines, is intelligent systems that help us think?
Well, when I was writing The Alchemy of Us, I wasn't quite convinced that machines would get us to wisdom, but I do think that that is ultimately the goal, because that's the point of getting old, to be wise and to pass on that information to the next generation. So so you should be, I think as humans, we should be always gaining information in hopes of becoming wise, not just having information just to spout that out to someone else. To, you know, the human head is, you know, 8 pounds. I mean, what am I going to do with that information? It should always be, we should always have that information as a way to condition, to see the world in a new way, to create. And so I don't know if machines are quite there. I don't know if that'll happen in my lifetime, but I do think as humans, that should be our point, to be more wise.
Yeah, I agree. And the way I see it, I think, is machine should be there to summarize data and provide a set of perspectives, not a singular perspective, that says, here are possible outcomes from this that you couldn't have analyzed yourself because the amount of data was overwhelming. But and I'm not going to give you a singular answer because that's bias. I'm going to give you a set of answers that are likely because based on the data and based on your need. So it has to understand the human need as well, to not just give random answers, but actually contextual answers for the problem I'm debating. I think there is a role for a machine to understand what I'm asking and to present me options. Does that make sense?
I think that, oh yeah, it certainly makes sense. I think if we build machines that way, we have to build humans the other way too. We need more critical thinkers, because the way that we educate right now, people don't know to make those kinds of decisions. If we are learning that we need to answer a test a certain way, we're like, what's the right answer? But what's the right answer? And if we have a machine just tells us the answer, then this is not necessarily always going to be best for humanity. So
I
we
think
need
we've
to
hit on something here, Ainissa. We have the answer to the question we've been wrestling with, is if machines could show us optionality in points of view, in opinions, in answer space, and we learn that in fact the world is not black and white but a set of colors, and we learn to operate on that set of answer colors, we'll be better off.
If the other side of the equation is to build better human thinkers.
Absolutely. So then we get better as thinkers, because as
We
you
get
say,
better,
the machines train us. We
That's
start
right.
thinking in multicolor and
That's
all
right.
versions of that. So then we start becoming better people because, of course, and then off we go. So you've
That
answered
makes
the
me
question.
hopeful.
We got there.
All right, we solved it.
Done. But we've got one more question from the
Okay.
interns, and it's a perfect one to end on. You've had diverse stops in your career. What pieces of career advice would you give to the interns, as they're generally undergrads, and a few are PhDs, and one or two are high school students. So what would you advise them to do so that they can become as wise, knowledgeable, and wonderful as you?
Well, I would say that you are your best experiment, and you get to have many careers. And so one of the things I learned is I put myself in different places. I met different people, did different things, and I would watch to see if I light up. If I lit up, I would say, oh, I think I'm excited about that, or I think I may have a skill for that. And you collect that data, because no one can tell you exactly what you're supposed to be. Right now, you're looking at one thing, and that may be exciting to you, or it may not. That's all information. There's no judgment to that. But you should be always putting yourself in a place where you're meeting new people, learning new things, and seeing where you light up. And that will give you a clue to what your life's calling is. So don't be afraid to do that. Many people know what their life calling is very early on. I thought for me it was being a scientist in the laboratory, and it was for a while. But over time, I saw that I lit up when I was communicating, and I saw that I lit up when I was writing. And here I am, half century years old, and I finally figured out one of the things I really, really love doing. But it wouldn't have happened if I wasn't willing to try new things. And so that's what I would tell young people today.
What a wonderful way to state it. And thanks so much, Ainissa. It's been wonderful.
Thank you for the opportunity, and everyone stay safe.